Elijah Rivers sat by the window, his pencil tapping against his notebook in a steady rhythm. It wasn't out of nerves, just an old habit his mother always told him to break. But it helped him think. The classroom at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas, buzzed with the usual pre-class chatter, but Elijah was lost in his work, already focused on the assignment in front of him. He liked finishing things early. His teacher, Miss Abigail Thornton, stood at the front of the room flipping through her notes. After 15 years of teaching sixth grade, she had built a reputation, strict but fair. At least that's what they said. But fairness depended on who you were. And Elijah, he had never been one of her favorites. It wasn't obvious. She never raised her voice or outright insulted him. But she never called on him, even when his hand shot up. If he answered correctly, she moved on as if it didn't matter. But if he got something wrong, a rare thing, she lingered, as if savoring the moment. He noticed, and so did his classmates. "Yo, she barely even looks at you," Tyler Whitman, the boy next to him, had whispered one afternoon. "You got, like, teacher invisibility or something?" Elijah had only shrugged. "Guess I do." But today something was different. Miss Thornton's gaze flickered to him more often than usual. It wasn't the kind of look that meant trouble. It was something else, something calculated. Anticipation. The lesson began. Another routine discussion on history. Something about the Civil War. Elijah listened, waiting for the usual pattern. But then, Elijah. The sound of his name froze him. Miss Thornton's voice was sharp, crisp, cutting through the classroom noise like a blade. "Why don't you answer this one?" Heads turned. Elijah blinked. She never called on him. Never. He straightened, scanning the board. Uh, General Sherman's March to the Sea. A military campaign designed to break the Confederacy's resources and morale. Miss Thornton hummed. Not bad. Not bad at all. Her expression was unreadable, but something shifted in the air. A few students exchanged glances. Tyler shot him a look that said, "What was that about?" Elijah didn't know, but he could feel it. Something had changed. The lesson carried on, but Miss Thornton's attention stayed on him. And then just before the bell rang, she struck. "Elijah," she said as students began packing up. "Stay behind for a moment." A few heads turned. No one spoke. Elijah took his time gathering his notebook, keeping his face neutral. Then he walked up to her desk. "I overheard you the other day," she said, clasping her hands together. "You mentioned your grandfather." Elijah frowned. "What about him?" "You said he was a musician." The air in the room grew heavier. There was something in her voice, something unsettling. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, he was a pianist. Played jazz." Her lips curled. Not a smile. Not really. Something closer to a smirk. "Interesting." She leaned back, drumming her fingers on the desk. "So you must have picked up a thing or two." Elijah didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he knew it didn't feel right. "A little," he admitted. Her smirk widened, but there was no warmth behind it. "Good to know." The bell rang. Elijah grabbed his bag and turned toward the door, eager to leave. But then, "Tomorrow," she said smoothly, "let's see what you've got." He turned back. "What?" She gestured toward the old upright piano sitting at the back of the room, covered in dust. "You'll play something for the class." A few students still lingering by the door froze, their eyes bouncing between him and Miss Thornton. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Why?" Miss Thornton tilted her head, amused. "Why not? Your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." Elijah knew that tone. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup. That night sleep never came. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every word, every smirk, every glance. This wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. a trap. She wanted him to fail, to stumble in front of everyone, to confirm whatever low expectations she already had of him. But she didn't know everything. The next morning, the air in the classroom felt different. Whispers trailed behind him as he walked to his seat. "You gonna play today?" Brandon Hall, one of the louder kids, smirked. Elijah didn't answer. Tyler leaned in. "Didn't know you were a piano guy." Elijah kept his eyes on his notebook. "There's a lot of things people don't know." Miss Thornton walked in, setting her books down with a quiet air of satisfaction. She barely acknowledged the murmurs. Her gaze flickered to Elijah, measuring, waiting. The game had begun. The first half of the class felt endless, each second stretching longer than it should. Words floated around Elijah, but none of them stuck. His mind was already at the moment he knew was coming, the moment she would call on him. And then she did. "Well," Miss Thornton said, snapping her book shut and glancing at the clock, "we have a little time before we move on." "Perfect." She turned, her eyes landing on the old upright piano sitting in the corner. "Elijah," she called, her voice carrying that same note of challenge, of certainty. "Let's see what you can do." The air in the room shifted. It wasn't loud, but Elijah could feel it. A ripple moving through his classmates, an unspoken exchange. A few students adjusted in their seats, some whispering, others already wearing smirks. He didn't move at first, letting the moment stretch just a little longer. His heartbeat was strong, steady, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to happen. Then he stood. A few muffled laughs broke the silence, scattered voices murmuring just beneath the surface. Elijah didn't need to hear the words to understand the tone. He had heard it before. Expectation wrapped in doubt, amusement at the idea that he might embarrass himself. Miss Thornton folded her hands together, watching him closely. "Play whatever you'd like." Elijah stepped forward, his gaze settling on the piano. It was old, its once white keys now yellowed with age, some chipped at the edges. He let his fingers drift over them, barely touching. The instrument was slightly out of tune, not enough to ruin a piece, but just enough that it mattered. He inhaled. Then without another word, he sat down. Somewhere behind him, a laugh was stifled, quiet but clear enough, a low snicker. It was all the confirmation he needed. This wasn't just about proving Miss Thornton wrong anymore. It was about proving everyone wrong. And he would do it in a way they would never forget. The room had never been this silent. Even Miss Thornton, who always carried herself with an air of knowing, seemed to hesitate, her gaze sharpening as if trying to predict what would happen next. The students leaned forward slightly, waiting. Some were expecting failure. Others were there simply for the spectacle. Elijah set his fingers on the keys. They felt familiar beneath his touch, though this piano was nothing like the one at home. His grandfather's piano had been rich, warm, the sound full enough to fill a room effortlessly. This one? The keys were stiff, the soundboard likely warped from years of neglect. But it didn't matter. He took a deep breath, let the silence settle over him. Then he played. The first few notes floated into the air, soft yet deliberate. A blues progression, the kind his grandfather had played on humid Arkansas afternoons, letting the music spill through the open windows. Elijah's fingers moved with confidence, his left hand keeping a steady rhythm, his right weaving a melody that felt like a story told in sound. The classroom changed. The whispers died. The smirks faded. Even those who had laughed sat frozen, their amusement replaced by something else, something unspoken. Miss Thornton's arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. This was not what she had expected. She had braced for hesitation, for nerves, for mistakes. Instead, she was hearing something she hadn't prepared for. Elijah didn't stop to see their faces. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself, for his grandfather. He let himself sink deeper into the music, feeling each note before it came, letting his hands move instinctively. This wasn't just skill, it was something more, something that lived in him, passed down through generations. Every key he pressed carried emotion, raw and real. Then he took a risk. He shifted into something more complex, letting his fingers dance across the keys in a series of intricate runs. A progression his grandfather had taught him, one that had taken him months to master. His hands moved effortlessly now, rolling through notes that clashed and resolved, tension and release in perfect harmony. The longer he played, the heavier the silence became. It wrapped around the room, filling the spaces where doubt had lived just moments ago. Tyler, sitting near the front, leaned forward, eyes wide with something close to awe. Brandon, who had cracked a joke earlier, sat with his arms crossed, but his smirk was long gone. Other students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from shock to something else, something dangerously close to admiration. Then came the crescendo. Elijah's fingers pressed harder, pulling the music to its peak, the chords swelling, filling every inch of the classroom. The walls, the floor, the air itself seemed to vibrate with sound. Every unspoken word, every moment of doubt, every challenge thrown his way, it was all there, in the music. And then, silence. The last note lingered for a breath, hanging in the air before fading. Elijah lifted his hands and let them rest in his lap. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then from the back of the room, one clap, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding. Tyler let out a low whistle. Damn. Brandon, still sitting with his arms crossed, gave a small shake of his head. I didn't know he could do that. Elijah exhaled, the energy still coursing through his veins. His heart wasn't pounding from nerves anymore. It was from something else entirely. He had done more than just play. He had changed something. The applause swelled. The students exchanged glances, their eyes wide with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Something they were never meant to see. Something that would linger in their minds long after this moment had passed. But the loudest silence in the room came from Ms. Thornton. Her face was unreadable, her arms still crossed, lips pressed into a firm line. The applause swelled around her, but she remained motionless, unspeaking. Elijah sat still, his hands resting lightly in his lap, breathing deep and steady. He wasn't smiling, wasn't searching for approval. He simply let the moment stretch, allowing everyone to sit with the gravity of what had just happened. Finally, Ms. Thornton spoke, her voice clipped and measured. Well, she said, pausing briefly, that was, unexpected. The clapping faded, replaced by hushed whispers as students glanced between Elijah and their teacher. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. This wasn't just about music anymore. Ms. Thornton tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp. Where did you learn to play like that? Elijah met her eyes, unwavering. My grandfather. Something flickered in her expression, but it was gone too quickly to name. She straightened, as if regaining control. I see. A brief pause. She tapped her fingers against the desk, the sound echoing in the room's hush. Then, shaking off whatever thoughts had passed through her mind, she turned to the class. All right, let's get back to the lesson. But nobody moved. Elijah glanced around. Tyler was still staring at him, eyebrows raised like he was struggling to process what he had just witnessed. At the back of the room, Madison Green looked almost annoyed, as if the moment had been cut short too soon. Across the aisle, Brandon scoffed under his breath. That's it? Miss Thornton's gaze snapped to him. Excuse me? Brandon shrugged, shifting in his seat. I mean, that's all you're going to say? He gestured vaguely. He just played like something off a movie soundtrack, and you're just going to move on? A few heads nodded in quiet agreement. Ms. Thornton's lips tightened. This is a classroom, not a talent show. Elijah took a slow breath, grounding himself. You didn't think I could play, did you? Her eyes flicked back to him, sharp and assessing. He didn't look away. That's why you called me up here, he continued, his voice calm but unwavering. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Miss Thornton inhaled slowly, her fingers curling slightly against the desk's edge. That's enough, Elijah. But he wasn't finished. But he wasn't finished. You wouldn't have asked Tyler, or Madison, or Brandon, but you asked me, why? The air in the room grew heavy. Students held their breath, their attention locked on the two of them. Ms. Thornton's jaw tightened. You're out of line. Elijah met her gaze steadily. I don't think I am. Her posture stiffened, her eyes darkening. Sit down. For the first time all year, Elijah didn't immediately obey. He looked around the classroom, the students who had overlooked him, the ones who had dismissed him, the ones who had smirked when his name was called. Then slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, alive with an energy no one could ignore. Ms. Thornton, always so composed, looked just a little shaken. But for once, she wasn't the one in control of the room. Elijah walked back to his seat, feeling the weight of every step. But his heart wasn't racing anymore. The nerves were gone. In their place was something steadier, something sure. He lowered himself into his chair, still aware of the stares from all around him. Tyler gave him a slow, knowing nod. No words were needed. Across the room, Madison remained locked onto Miss Thornton, her arms crossed, waiting. But Miss Thornton didn't acknowledge her. Instead, she turned back to her lesson plan, flipping the pages with forced focus, her eyes fixed on the paper. Let's move on. But the classroom didn't settle as quickly as she had hoped. The energy lingered, thick with an unspoken shift. Quiet whispers filled the room. Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Kind of weird how you don't want to talk about it. Ms. Thornton's eyes snapped up. Excuse me? Brandon shrugged. You made a big deal about him playing, but now you're acting like it never happened. More quiet murmurs. Agreement. Ms. Thornton's grip on her book tightened. That's enough. But Elijah had seen it. The hesitation, the discomfort. And now so had everyone else. For the rest of class, her usual authority felt thinner, like a sheet of glass with a deep, visible crack running through it. She still taught. She still controlled the lesson. But something had shifted, and no one could unsee it. When the bell finally rang, chairs scraped against the floor as students gathered their things, murmuring as they filed out. Elijah slung his bag over his shoulder, moving toward the door. But just as he reached it, Miss Thornton called his name. Elijah. He turned back. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something real, something meaningful. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. I hope you understand, she said, her voice steady, that this is still my classroom. Elijah studied her, and then, in the same quiet, steady voice he had used before, he answered, I know. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then he turned and walked out. In the hallway, Tyler caught up to him, shaking his head with a grin. Bro, what was that? Elijah exhaled, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. I don't know. Tyler nudged his shoulder. So, you gonna play again? Elijah thought about the way the keys had felt beneath his fingers, about the way the music had filled the room. He smiled. Yeah, I think I will. Because today he hadn't just played a song, he had been heard. The weight he had been carrying, the tension, the doubt, had lifted. He walked home lighter, the golden sun casting long shadows along West Markham Street. At the corner store, he stopped to grab a bottle of water, Mr. Henson, the shop's elderly owner, studied him with knowing eyes. You look like a kid who just did something important. Elijah hesitated, then smiled. Maybe I did. By the time he reached home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread filled the air. His mother stood at the stove, humming softly as she worked. You're home late, she noted without turning. Elijah dropped his bag and sat at the kitchen table. Had a long day. She glanced over her shoulder. Good or bad? He thought about the silence, the stares, the shift in the air. Good, he said finally. Really good. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and sat across from him. Want to talk about it? He nodded. For the next 15 minutes, he told her everything. She listened, her expression shifting between concern, pride, and something softer. When he finished, she exhaled, thoughtful. Sounds like you made her uncomfortable. I think I did. She studied him. And how do you feel about that? Elijah didn't need to think. Like it was supposed to happen. She reached across the table, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Good. The next day, school was different. Not drastically. Miss Thornton still ran her class the same way. But the energy had shifted. People saw her differently, and they saw Elijah differently too. During lunch, students who had never spoken to him before stopped by his table. Dude, you were insane on that piano, Madison said, sliding into the seat across from him. How long have you been playing? Since I was 5. Tyler shook his head. Man, you've been holding out on us. Elijah smirked. Guess so. From across the cafeteria, Ms. Thornton passed by, tray in hand. Their eyes met. This time she was the one who looked away first. And Elijah? He just kept eating. Because some lessons aren't found in books. Some moments change how people see the world, whether they want to or not. And when people try to silence you, when they try to underestimate you, the best thing you can do is let your talents speak louder than their doubts. Because once you do, they have no choice but to listen.